March 1945. The Allies stood before the last water barrier on the path to the heart of Nazi Germany, the mighty Rhine. This river, turbulent and wide, was not merely a geographical marker, it was the last natural barrier, the last hope for the Third Reich. On the Western Front, the situation was escalating. After the bloody defeat in the Ardennes, German troops were exhausted, but the Rhine remained their last frontier. Beyond it lay industrial centers, particularly the Ruhr region, the forge of war, the fuel for the Nazi war machine. The capture of this territory would mean the inevitable collapse of German defenses. The Allies faced a monumental task: to cross the Rhine, overcome desperate resistance, and deliver the decisive blow that would hasten the end of this terrible war. After the devastating defeat in the Ardennes, where German forces lost up to 100,000 men killed, wounded, and captured, as well as a huge amount of equipment, the Western Front found itself in a critical situation for the Third Reich. The Allies, on the contrary, inspired by their success, though having suffered serious losses, now felt a strategic advantage. By March 1945, Anglo-American forces stood along the entire western bank of the Rhine, preparing for a decisive push. Their forces were at the peak of their might, excellently equipped, with air superiority and virtually inexhaustible supplies. The Americans, under the command of Dwight Eisenhower, had three army groups, the 6th, 12th, and 21st, comprising 15 armies, with a total strength of over 4.5 million men. British and Canadian forces, part of the 21st Army Group under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, were also ready for the offensive. These forces were reinforced by French units, which, despite the recent liberation of their country, actively participated in the fighting. Before them lay the last exhausted and demoralized divisions of the Wehrmacht. Many German soldiers were conscripted from the Volkssturm, elderly people and teenagers barely trained and poorly armed. Their morale was undermined by continuous retreats and the realization of the hopelessness of their situation. German units, stretched along an enormous front line, suffered from a catastrophic shortage of fuel, ammunition, and provisions. Constant Allied air bombardments paralyzed Germany's transport system, depriving the front of reinforcements and supplies. Against this backdrop, the successes of Soviet troops on the Eastern Front seemed particularly ominous to the Germans. The Red Army was rapidly advancing towards Berlin, drawing a significant portion of German resources and leaving the Wehrmacht no chance to transfer reinforcements to the west. Germany, squeezed between two powerful fronts, was bleeding dry. Within the country, contradictions were growing. Between the Western Allies, despite a common goal, tensions also arose. Eisenhower and Montgomery disagreed on strategy, which added further complications to the planning of the upcoming operation. However, despite all these disagreements, a common belief in a swift victory united the Allies. They understood. The Rhine was the last barrier, beyond which lay the path to the final defeat of the Third Reich. Preparations for this grandiose operation were in full swing, and each day brought the moment of truth closer. Now that the situation on the Western Front was clear, the main question facing the Allied command was how to cross the Rhine. The development of detailed operational plans was carried out in conditions of strict secrecy at the headquarters of the Allied Supreme Command. This was not just military planning, it was a grandiose logistical and strategic challenge that required the coordination of efforts of millions of people and thousands of units of equipment. The Allies understood that crossing the Rhine would be one of the largest and most complex operations of World War II. The main role in this strategic design was assigned to an operation codenamed Plunder. It envisioned crossing the Rhine in the northern part, in the area of the cities of Wesel and Dinslaken, by forces of the 21st Army Group under the command of Field Marshal Montgomery. This included the British 2nd Army and the American 9th Army. Their task was to create a powerful bridgehead on the eastern bank, break through the German defenses, and advance deep into the Ruhr area. But plunder would not have been so effective without air support. It was for this purpose that the accompanying Operation Varsity was developed. This was the largest planned airborne operation of World War II, the goal of which was to drop thousands of paratroopers and glider troops directly behind the German defense line on the eastern bank of the Rhine. The American 17th and British 6th Airborne Divisions were to disorganize the enemy, seize key objectives such as bridges and artillery positions, and thereby facilitate the advance of ground troops. The third, no less important part of the plan was Operation Grenade. It envisioned an attack by the American 9th Army, which was to cross the Rhine further south in the area of the city of Dusseldorf, and then link up with the troops advancing as part of Plunder. This created powerful pincers that were to encircle and block German forces in the Ruhr pocket. The distribution of roles between the US, British, and Canadian armies was clearly defined. The Americans, with significant resources and numerical superiority, were to ensure the main breakthrough and encirclement of the Ruhr. The British and Canadians, in turn, concentrated on creating a powerful bridgehead and consolidating positions. However, planning was only half the battle. The logistical challenges were colossal. Crossing a wide river required hundreds of pontoons, amphibious vehicles, ferries, and a huge amount of engineering equipment. All this had to be delivered to the front, under constant German counterattacks and destroyed infrastructure. The bridges across the Rhine, with the exception of a few miraculously surviving ones, had been blown up by the Germans, which meant the need to build new crossings under enemy fire. Food, ammunition, fuel for millions of soldiers and thousands of units of equipment. All this required an uninterrupted supply. Engineering units worked day and night, preparing crossing equipment, clearing roads, and creating conditions for a massive offensive. Medical services prepared to receive thousands of wounded. Evacuation routes were planned, and field hospitals were deployed in the frontline zone. This was a true war machine, finely tuned to the smallest detail. Every soldier, from the ordinary infantryman to the supreme commander, understood that at stake was not just victory in battle, but the end of the entire war. The Rhine was the last barrier, and overcoming it became a matter of honor and destiny for the entire Allied command. All these preparations were aimed at delivering a crushing blow that would break the enemy's will and bring closer the long-awaited peace. Against the backdrop of these grandiose plans, behind the scenes of the grand strategy, its own, no less intense drama unfolded. At its center were two key figures of the Allied command: the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, American General Dwight Eisenhower, and the commander of the 21st Army Group, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Their relationship was complex, full of respect, but also constant contradictions, which became particularly evident during the planning of the Rhine offensive. Eisenhower, being a pragmatic and diplomatic man, aimed for a broad front of attack, distributing forces evenly to crush German defenses as quickly as possible. His approach was based on the idea of constant pressure on the enemy along the entire front line, precluding the possibility of German reserves being transferred to critically important sectors. He thought on a grand scale, saw the whole picture of the European theater of war, and tried to coordinate the actions of the Western Allies with the advance of the Red Army on the Eastern Front. Montgomery, on the other hand, was a proponent of the so-called narrow front. He proposed concentrating maximum forces in one decisive direction, delivering a powerful, penetrating blow that would split the German defenses and allow for a rapid advance deep into Germany. His strategy was riskier, but potentially faster. The field marshal believed in concentrated power, in one punch, rather than splayed fingers, as he put it, criticizing Eisenhower's approach. These fundamental differences in strategy led to constant disputes and disagreements. Montgomery, known for his directness and sometimes arrogance, did not hesitate to openly express his disagreement with Eisenhower's decisions. He insisted that the main efforts to cross the Rhine should be concentrated under his command, using all available resources, including American troops. In turn, Eisenhower, while appreciating Montgomery's military talent, could not afford to ignore the interests of other Allied armies and American generals, who also sought active participation in the decisive offensive. One of the most acute issues was the use of airborne forces. Montgomery, inspired by the success of Operation Market Garden, albeit with reservations, was convinced of the need for a massive paratrooper landing to seize key objectives and disorganize the enemy. He saw this as a way to accelerate the breakthrough and minimize ground troop casualties. Eisenhower, remembering the high casualties in Market Garden and realizing the risks of such operations, was more cautious. He insisted on more thorough preparation and coordination of the landing with ground forces to avoid repeating tragic mistakes. Despite all these frictions, a compromise was ultimately found. Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, accepted some of Montgomery's proposals, but also insisted on including a broader offensive front in the operation plan. He understood that to achieve the common goal, a swift victory, it was necessary to consider both the ambitions of individual commanders and the overall strategic picture. Mutual respect, despite disagreements, allowed them to work together, because something greater than personal ambitions or tactical preferences was at stake. The fate of the war was at stake, and both generals understood this perfectly. Their combined efforts, albeit with friction, laid the foundation for one of the largest and most complex offensives of World War II. While the Allies on the Rhine's west bank meticulously planned every step of the upcoming operation, a far grimmer picture unfolded on the river's east bank. Here, on the last line of defense, Field Marshal Walter Model, a man dubbed Hitler's fireman for his ability to stabilize the most desperate situations, took command of the German forces. But even for him, the task he faced in March 1945 seemed almost insurmountable. Army Group B, commanded by Model, was but a pale shadow of the mighty war machine that had once terrorized all of Europe. After the Ardennes failure and continuous retreats, it was exhausted, depleted, and demoralized. Its strength numbered around 325,000 men, but this figure was deceptive. Many were either boys from the Hitler Youth, barely out of childhood, or elderly men from the Volkssturm, who could barely hold a rifle. Experienced soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front, were catastrophically few. Their morale was broken by the understanding of the hopelessness of their situation and constant defeats. Armament was another sore point. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, all were critically scarce. What remained suffered from a lack of fuel and spare parts. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable force, was now almost entirely absent from the skies over the Rhine, leaving ground troops exposed to the all-powerful Allied Air Force. Ammunition was severely restricted, and food was on the verge of exhaustion. German soldiers were often hungry and ill-equipped, which only worsened their morale. Model, despite all his experience, found himself trapped. He had to defend a vast front, from the Netherlands to Switzerland, with minimal resources. His strategy was forced and desperate. To maximize the use of natural barriers, primarily the Rhine itself, and to create an echeloned defense from what was at hand. Fortifications were hastily erected on the east bank of the Rhine. Anti-tank ditches, minefields, machine gun nests, trenches. Many were poorly equipped and lacked sufficient defenders. All bridges and key infrastructure were mined to delay the Allied advance. Model's tactic was to inflict maximum damage on the Allies during the river crossing, and then, using the extremely scarce mobile reserves, counterattack and push them back into the Rhine. He calculated that the river itself would become an insurmountable obstacle, a trap for the advancing troops. However, his calculations did not account for the total Allied air superiority and their engineering capabilities. He lacked sufficient forces for powerful counterattacks, and the absence of fuel made the transfer of even small reserves incredibly slow and vulnerable to airstrikes. In the complete absence of air support, with exhausted and demoralized troops, Model understood that every attempt to hold the Rhine would come at a huge cost in lives. He prepared for a final, desperate battle, realizing that there was almost no chance of success. The only thing he could offer his soldiers was an order to fight to the last, clinging to every meter of German soil, trying to delay the inevitable. It was this almost hopeless defense that the Allies would face when they began their grand operation to cross the Rhine. And so, at this tense moment, when all eyes were fixed on the northern section of the Rhine, where Montgomery's main attack was planned, history wrote its own, completely unexpected script. On March 7, 1945, near the small town of Remagen, an event occurred that forever changed the course of the Rhine operation, and perhaps accelerated the end of the war. The American 9th Armored Division, advancing as part of the First Army's broader offensive, was ordered to move towards the Rhine. Their objective was not a bridge, but the riverbank itself. However, as they approached Remagen, scouts reported the incredible. The Ludendorff Railway Bridge, connecting the two banks of the Rhine, was still standing. This was a miracle, as the Germans, in retreat, had been blowing up all crossings behind them. But this bridge, as if by fate, remained intact. It had been mined, and German sappers were already attempting to blow it up, but for some reason, the charges did not fully detonate. Perhaps haste played a role, perhaps a lack of experience among the last reservists hastily thrown to the front. When the advanced American units, consisting of the 99th Infantry Battalion and the 27th Armored Battalion, saw the bridge, their commanders made an instantaneous, risky decision. Instead of waiting for orders or the advance of the main forces, they launched an assault. This was the embodiment of the American spirit of initiative and daring. Soldiers, under the cover of tanks, literally ran across the bridge while German sappers frantically tried to fix the malfunctions. Several charges did detonate, but the bridge held. The secret to success lay in the astonishing speed and coordination of the American soldiers. Sergeant Alexander Drabik became the first American soldier to step onto the eastern bank of the Rhine via this bridge. He was followed by his comrades who, without losing a minute, began to consolidate their position on the opposite bank. The Germans, caught by surprise, were unable to organize effective resistance. Their defenses in this area were weak, and the command did not expect such audacity from the enemy. The Ludendorff Bridge, originally intended for the retreat of German troops and subsequent destruction, now found itself in American hands. The German command was in shock. Field Marshal Model, upon learning of the bridge's capture, was furious. He fully understood the strategic significance of this failure. The bridge at Remagen was a shortcut deep into Germany, opening the way to the Ruhr area. Hitler, upon learning of what had happened, immediately ordered the bridge to be destroyed at all costs. All available means were thrown at it. Artillery, aviation, even special units attempting to blow up the bridge with fireboats. However, none of these attempts were successful. The Americans, understanding the value of the captured bridgehead, immediately began to fortify it, ferrying thousands of soldiers and hundreds of pieces of equipment across the bridge. The capture of the Remagen Bridge became a colossal strategic success for the Allies. It allowed them to establish a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine 2 weeks earlier than planned, and to cross the river without a single shot, avoiding the bloody battles that would inevitably have awaited them in a normal crossing. This breakthrough disrupted all German defense plans, caused chaos in their ranks, and forced them to transfer scarce reserves to the south, weakening defenses in the north, where the main blow was being prepared. For the Allies, this was not just a tactical success, it was a powerful psychological blow to the enemy, and a huge morale boost for their own troops. Eisenhower called the capture of the bridge gold. He immediately ordered this opportunity to be exploited to the maximum, transferring all possible forces across it. Within days, thousands of soldiers and hundreds of units of equipment crossed the Ludendorff Bridge, creating a powerful bridgehead that became the starting point for a further advance deep into Germany. Alas, the bridge itself, having withstood several days of fierce German attacks and the colossal load from crossing troops, could not hold and collapsed on March 17th, taking the lives of 28 American engineers. But by that time, its task had already been accomplished. The bridgehead was firmly secured, and the Rhine, that last barrier, had been overcome. After the unexpected capture of the Remagen Bridge, which opened a corridor for the Allies to the eastern bank of the Rhine, the culmination arrived. The time allotted for preparation had run out. On the night of March 22nd to 23rd, 1945, under the cloak of darkness, Operation Plunder began, a grandiose offensive that was to finally break the back of the German defense. This was not just an assault. It was a carefully planned, multi-layered operation where every detail mattered. The main thrust was delivered by the forces of the 21st Army Group under the command of Field Marshal Montgomery, which included the British 2nd Army and the American 9th Army. Their goal was to cross the Rhine in the area of Wesel and Dinslaken, creating a strong bridgehead that would serve as a starting point for further advance into Germany towards the industrial heart of the Third Reich, the Ruhr region. Several hours before dawn, when a dense veil of night still hung over the Rhine, the sky lit up with flashes. Not hundreds, but thousands of guns, from light howitzers to heavy siege mortars, opened fire. This was a massive artillery barrage, unprecedented in its power and density. Shells rained down by the ton on German positions on the eastern bank, turning them into a mess of earth, concrete, and metal. The purpose of this hurricane of fire was not only to destroy fortifications and enemy personnel, but also to suppress their will to resist. The cannonade was so intense that it could be heard for hundreds of kilometers, and the ground shook as if from an earthquake. Volleys followed one after another without interruption, creating a wall of fire that slowly moved deeper into the German defenses. It was a real hell that was intended to clear the way for the offensive. Simultaneously with the artillery shelling, the Allies employed another powerful tool: smoke screens. Hundreds of smoke generators and mortars firing smoke shells created an impenetrable shroud that covered the Rhine for many kilometers. This wall of smoke was intended to hide the movement of Allied troops and crossing equipment from German observers. Under the cover of this veil, Like ghosts, the first waves of landing groups began to move towards the bank. In complete silence, broken only by the distant roar of artillery, engineering units began their work. They used all available means for crossing, from small assault boats capable of carrying a few soldiers to huge amphibious transporters such as the famous ducks, which could carry entire tanks and artillery pieces. Special attention was paid to the construction of pontoon bridges. These were true engineering marvels, assembled under enemy fire. Thousands of engineers risking their lives worked in the darkness, connecting sections of bridges to ensure the uninterrupted transfer of troops and equipment as quickly as possible. These bridges were vital for maintaining the pace of the offensive. The assault teams were the first to cross the Rhine. Soldiers of the British Second Army and the American Ninth Army, despite fatigue and nervous tension, acted cohesively and decisively. Their task was to capture the first German trenches, suppress strong points, and secure a bridgehead for the landing of the main forces. In conditions of total Allied superiority in firepower and complete air dominance, German resistance was desperate but fragmented. Many German soldiers who had survived the artillery preparation were stunned and demoralized. They fought to the last, but their strength was waning. Heavy fighting unfolded on the bank, where every meter of ground had to be won with blood. However, the Allies managed to establish a foothold, and within a few hours, the first bridgeheads were created on the eastern bank of the Rhine. This was just the beginning. At dawn, as the smoke screen began to dissipate, another spectacle appeared over the Rhine that finally broke the Germans' will to resist. Thousands of transport aircraft and gliders appeared in the sky, carrying thousands of paratroopers. This was Operation Varsity, the largest airborne landing in the history of World War II, which was to be another blow to the heart of the German defense. But we will talk about that in the next part. For now, the main thing had been done. The Rhine, this last water barrier, had been crossed. Operation Plunder had successfully begun, opening the way to the final defeat of the Third Reich. At dawn on March 24, 1945, as the smoke screen over the Rhine began to dissipate, the sky above the river's east bank filled with an unprecedented spectacle. It was an aerial bridge woven from thousands of aircraft, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers. Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne operation in the history of World War II, had begun. It was intended to deliver a decisive blow behind German lines, facilitating the advance of ground troops who were crossing the Rhine as part of Operation Plunder. The goal of this grand operation was not merely to drop paratroopers, but to seize key objectives behind the front line: roads, bridges, artillery positions, command posts, as well as to disorganize the enemy's rear, sow panic, and divert his forces from coastal fortifications. 2 airborne divisions participated in the landing. The American 17th Airborne Division, comprising about 9,000 men, and the British 6th Airborne Division, numbering approximately 7,000 men. The total strength of the airborne assault exceeded 16,000 men. Their transport was provided by over 1,600 transport aircraft, C-47 Dakota and C-46 Commando, and about 1,300 gliders, such as the British Horsa and the American Waco. These gliders, engineless but capable of carrying significant cargo and up to 30 soldiers, were towed by aircraft and then silently glided to their landing zones. The landing began around 10 o'clock in the morning. At an altitude of only 300 to 600 meters, to minimize exposure to enemy fire, paratroopers began to jump. They were followed by gliders, landing directly in fields and wooded areas, marked in advance. The The sight was stunning. The sky was literally dotted with parachute canopies and the ground with hundreds of landing gliders. This massive landing was so dense and rapid that the Germans, despite intelligence warnings, were literally stunned. Many of them, still recovering from the night's artillery preparation, did not have time to organize effective resistance. However, the operation was not without losses. The Germans, though caught off guard, still had anti-aircraft batteries and individual units in this sector of the front that offered fierce resistance. Some transport aircraft and gliders were shot down. Others sustained serious damage. Losses were particularly heavy among glider pilots, who became easy targets upon landing. Total Allied losses in Operation Varsity amounted to about 2,500 men killed, wounded, and missing. About 600 transport aircraft and gliders were damaged or destroyed. This was a high price, but the objectives of the operation were achieved. Despite the losses, the paratroopers accomplished their missions with striking effectiveness. The British 6th Airborne Division captured bridges over the Isle River, as well as several key road junctions, ensuring the unimpeded advance of the British Second Army. The American 17th Airborne Division captured several German artillery batteries that were shelling the Rhine crossings and occupied settlements, establishing a bridgehead for further offensive. Thanks to their actions, the German defense was fractured, and enemy communication and supply lines were disrupted. The disorganization in German ranks was so severe that Allied ground forces crossing the Rhine encountered much less resistance than expected. Operation Varsity became a vivid example of how the massive employment of airborne forces, coordinated with a ground offensive, can significantly accelerate the pace of an operation and minimize losses of main forces. It demonstrated the colossal Allied air superiority and their ability to strike deep into enemy defenses. The airborne landing had a huge psychological impact on German soldiers, who, caught between two fires, ground forces advancing from the west and airborne troops landing from the east, finally lost the will to resist. Many of them simply surrendered, realizing the hopelessness of their situation. Varsity's impact on the overall course of the Rhine crossing was colossal. It not only ensured the rapid capture of bridgeheads and the disorganization of German forces, but also allowed ground troops to advance rapidly deep into Germany. By the evening of March 24th, in the vicinity of Wesel and Dinslaken, the bridgeheads of the American 9th and British 2nd Armies were firmly secured and began to expand. The link-up of airborne troops with forces advancing from the Rhine occurred within several hours of the landing, confirming the success of the meticulously planned coordination. This aerial bridge became one of the symbols of the final defeat of Nazi Germany, opening the way to its industrial heartland and hastening the end of the war. Against the backdrop of this fiery and aerial storm, while paratroopers fought in the German rear and infantry consolidated bridgeheads, the true heroes of the Rhine operation were the engineers. It was on their shoulders that the colossal task fell, to ensure the uninterrupted crossing of the widest water barrier and to establish supplies for millions of soldiers and thousands of units of equipment. This was a true engineering marvel, unfolding before the eyes of the entire world. The wide, full-flowing Rhine presented a formidable obstacle. Moving troops and equipment across it required not only courage, but also unprecedented technical equipment. The Allies had prepared for this in advance, accumulating huge reserves of landing craft and bridging equipment. Everything was used, from small assault boats capable of holding only a few people to giant amphibious transporters, striking in their power and versatility. Amphibious transporters became one of the most recognizable symbols of this operation. For example, the famous ducks, modified trucks capable of moving both on land and water. These vehicles proved indispensable, transporting infantry, ammunition, and light equipment directly across the river. Alongside them worked heavier amphibians, designed for transporting tanks and artillery. Their massive hulls slowly but surely crossed the Rhine, delivering armored fists to the eastern bank, necessary for expanding the bridgeheads. But the true queen of the crossing was the pontoon bridges. In conditions where all stationary bridges had been blown up by the Germans, these floating structures became a vital supply artery. Allied engineering battalions, consisting of thousands of highly skilled specialists, worked around the clock, under constant enemy fire, and in conditions of incredible stress. They assembled bridge sections, consisting of metal trusses and floating supports, joining them together to create strong and reliable crossings. The construction of these bridges was a heroic feat. In the Wesel and Dinslaken area alone, where the British 2nd and American 9th Armies crossed the Rhine, engineers built more than 20 pontoon bridges of various types and sizes. Some of them were capable of withstanding the weight of heavy tanks, while others were intended for infantry and light equipment. The longest of these bridges reached almost 400 meters in length, which was a true engineering achievement of that time. Work proceeded continuously, in several shifts, under the light of searchlights and in complete darkness, to ensure an uninterrupted flow of troops and cargo. In addition to pontoon bridges, engineers also built other types of crossings. Ferries, towed by powerful boats, were used to transport particularly heavy equipment. Temporary piers and ramps were created for unloading amphibious vehicles. Entire logistical complexes with refueling, repair, and ammunition replenishment points were deployed along the riverbanks. All this required not only technical knowledge, but also incredible coordination and dedication. Engineering units not only built, but also maintained the crossings in working order. The Rhine River, even in March, was treacherous, with strong currents and periodic floods. The bridges required constant monitoring, repair, and reinforcement. Sappers cleared mines from the banks, cleared approaches to the crossings, and laid new roads, ensuring the fastest possible movement of convoys. Thanks to this engineering genius and dedicated labor, the Allies were able to ensure uninterrupted supply to the advancing troops. Streams of tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery, trucks with food and ammunition continuously moved across the Rhine, maintaining the pace of the offensive and giving the Germans no respite. This material and technical superiority became one of the key factors in the success of the Rhine operation. Without these bridges, without these amphibians, without the thousands of engineers who risked their lives, the crossing of the Rhine and the subsequent breakthrough to the Ruhr area would have been impossible. This was not just a feat of military engineers, it was proof of the Allies' technological and organizational superiority, which finally broke the Third Reich's will to resist. Only a few days had passed since the crossing of the Rhine and the airborne landing, but fierce battles for the expansion and unification of the captured bridgeheads were already unfolding on the river's east bank. The Allied command, understanding the strategic importance of every inch of reclaimed land, gave the Germans no respite. After the successful start of Operation Plunder and the stunning varsity airborne assault, the British 2nd and American 9th Armies began a methodical expansion of their positions. Their tactics were simple and effective. Constant pressure, deep breakthroughs with armored vehicles, and swift outflanking of enemy strongholds. The British, operating in the north, advanced towards the city of Wesel, which had been turned into a powerful defensive node. The Americans, in turn, expanded their bridgeheads further south, targeting industrial areas. Their main task was not merely to hold what they had captured, but to unite the disparate sections into a single, robust zone of control. This would create a continuous front, allowing forces and equipment to be moved without risk of being cut off. In these days, every hill, every village, every grove became an arena for fierce clashes. German troops, though demoralized and exhausted, still offered resistance, sometimes desperate. They clung to every opportunity to slow the Allied advance, understanding that retreat would mean the loss of their last chances. However, their counterattacks were ineffective and largely localized. The German command, attempting to halt the offensive, threw its last reserves into battle. Remnants of tank and infantry divisions assembled from various units, as well as Volkssturm units. But these forces were too weak to withstand the well-equipped and numerically superior Allies. Any attempt by the Germans to concentrate troops for a counterattack was immediately thwarted by Allied air power. The sky over the Rhine belonged entirely to American and British aircraft. Fighter bombers continuously patrolled the territory, striking vehicle columns, troop concentrations, artillery positions, and railway hubs. Any movement of German troops during the day was tantamount to suicide. Absolute air superiority deprived the Germans of the ability to maneuver, transfer reinforcements, and resupply. Their artillery, already scarce, was suppressed by powerful Allied counter-battery fire, and ammunition and fuel depots were destroyed by bombing. This created a, quote, zero effect for Allied troops. They could move relatively freely, while the enemy was forced to hide and operate only under the cover of night, which significantly slowed their reactions. The Allies' technical equipment also played a decisive role. Sherman and Cromwell tanks, armored personnel carriers, self-propelled artillery units, all this allowed them to advance rapidly, suppress strong points, and effectively repel counterattacks. Engineering units worked continuously, building new bridges, clearing roads, and demining territories, ensuring uninterrupted supply to the advancing units. Just a few days after the start of the operation, the bridgeheads were significantly expanded. The British Second Army, overcoming stubborn resistance, captured Wesel, and the American Ninth Army, advancing rapidly, linked up with units that had crossed the Rhine further south, thereby creating a single, continuous front line. This unification of the bridgeheads became a key moment, opening the way for further advance into Germany and the encirclement of the Ruhr industrial area. German troops, trapped, were forced to retreat, leaving behind destroyed cities and villages, and realizing that the Rhine, which was supposed to be their last stand, had been breached. Now, the path to the heart of the Third Reich was open, and stopping the Allies was no longer possible. After the bridgeheads on the eastern bank of the Rhine were successfully expanded and consolidated, the strategic initiative fully shifted to the Allies. Now, one of the main objectives of the Rhine operation lay before them: the encirclement and neutralization of the Ruhr industrial region. This was not merely a geographical area. It was the industrial heart of the Third Reich, the forge that hammered out weapons, tanks, and ammunition for the German war machine. Without the Ruhr, Germany would be doomed. The Allied command understood this perfectly, and the plan to create a pocket around this vital area was developed with surgical precision. The offensive developed along two main axes, forming gigantic pincers. From the south, the American First Army, which had already secured a foothold on the eastern bank of the Rhine thanks to the unexpected capture of the Remagen bridge, rapidly advanced. Their path lay through the cities of Siegen and Marburg, encompassing the Ruhr from the south and east. From the north, from their bridgeheads established during Operation Plunder, the American Ninth Army advanced. It moved towards the cities of Münster and Paderborn, aiming to close the ring from the north and east. British forces, also participating in plunder, provided flank coverage and advanced in a northeastward direction, drawing away a portion of German forces. The actions of the American armies were coordinated and incredibly swift. The First Army, utilizing its already established bridgehead, developed the offensive with unprecedented speed. Its armored divisions, encountering no organized resistance, literally swept across German territories. The morale of the German troops, caught between a hammer and an anvil, was completely broken. Many units, consisting of inexperienced recruits and elderly Volkssturm soldiers, simply surrendered or dispersed at the first appearance of American tanks. The Ninth Army, leveraging the advantage created by the combined air and ground assault, also moved rapidly. Airborne units, dropped as part of Operation Varsity, had already disorganized German defenses, destroying key communication nodes and seizing important road junctions. This allowed ground troops to bypass many fortified areas and advance deep into enemy territory without spending time on protracted battles. Their main goal was to meet up with units of the First Army as soon as possible to finally close the encirclement ring. The speed of the Allied advance was so great that the German command could not adequately react to the changing situation. Field Marshal Model, commander of Army Group B, found himself in a desperate position. His troops were stretched thin, exhausted, and practically without supplies. The lack of fuel paralyzed maneuvers, and the complete dominance of Allied air power made any daytime movement extremely dangerous. Attempts to organize counterattacks ended in failure, as any concentrations of German troops were immediately subjected to massive airstrikes. The Ruhr area was of colossal importance to the German war economy. Here were the largest coal mines, steel mills, and enterprises for the production of weapons and ammunition. Without these resources, the Third Reich could not continue the war. The encirclement of the Ruhr meant not only the loss of industrial capacity, but also the capture of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who were involved in its defense. This would not just be a blow, but a death sentence for Nazi Germany. By April 1, 1945, the pincers had closed. Units of the American 1st and 9th Armies met near the city of Lippstadt, forming a gigantic pocket around the Ruhr industrial region. Inside this encirclement were the remnants of Field Marshal Model's Army Group B. By various estimates, from 325,000 to 400,000 German soldiers. This was the largest concentration of German troops encircled on the Western Front throughout the war. The consequences of this encirclement were catastrophic for Germany. The loss of the Ruhr area deprived it of its last industrial capacities necessary to continue resistance. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers who could have been used to defend other sectors of the front were trapped. It also opened the way for the Allies to advance unhindered deep into Germany, to the Elbe and beyond. The encirclement of the Ruhr became not just a tactical success, but a strategic triumph that hastened the end of the war on the Western Front. Now the Allies faced the task of eliminating this enormous pocket. But that is another story, one that will unfold in the coming days. By April 1, 1945, the Allied pincers had finally closed. Elements of the American 1st and 9th Armies met near the city of Lippstadt, forming a gigantic pocket around the Ruhr industrial area. Trapped within this encirclement were the remnants of Field Marshal Model's Army Group B. By various estimates, between 325,000 and 400,000 German soldiers. This was the largest grouping of German forces encircled on the Western Front throughout the war. Now the Allies faced the task of liquidating this enormous, quote, dismembering it and destroying it. This was not merely the capture of territory, but the systematic destruction of the last organized force capable of offering any resistance to the advance. The Allied armies acted methodically and mercilessly. The American Ninth Army, advancing from the north, and the First Army, pushing from the south, began to tighten the encirclement. Their primary goal was not so much the complete annihilation of the enemy in open combat, but rather their disorganization, demoralization, and forcing them to surrender. Allied troops, with overwhelming superiority in numbers, equipment, and most importantly, morale, systematically swept through the Ruhr territory, striking at scattered pockets of resistance. Each day brought new losses for the Germans. The absence of centralized command, a shattered communications system, and a chronic shortage of ammunition, food, and fuel. All of this turned resistance into a meaningless agony. German soldiers, many of whom were elderly men or boys thrown onto the front, found themselves trapped. They were cut off from the outside world, with no hope of reinforcement or evacuation. Morale was utterly broken. Daily, thousands of German soldiers surrendered, understanding the hopelessness of their situation. Among them were those who fought to the last, but their heroism was doomed. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, found himself in a desperate situation. He was one of Hitler's most loyal generals, a man who had always believed in the possibility of victory. But now even he realized that it was all over. His army was encircled, fragmented into small, isolated groups, deprived of supplies and the ability to maneuver. Hitler, in his madness, ordered Model to fight to the last man, forbidding any surrender. But Model, being a realist, understood that this would only mean a senseless slaughter. On April 9, 1945, elements of the American First Army broke into the city of Wuppertal, where Model's headquarters was located. The field marshal, realizing that his encirclement was inevitable and the path of retreat cut off, made a tragic decision. He did not want to be taken prisoner, did not want to witness the final collapse of the Third Reich. On April 19, 1945, in a forest near the city of Duisburg, Walter Model committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. He became one of the few German field marshals who preferred death to captivity. His suicide became a symbol of the complete collapse of German defense on the Western Front. With his death, the last remnants of organized resistance in the Ruhr pocket ceased. On April 21, 1945, after 2 weeks of fierce but hopeless fighting, the encircled German forces in the Ruhr capitulated. 325,000 German soldiers and officers were taken prisoner by the Allies. This was the largest single surrender of German troops on the Western Front throughout the war. The consequences of this event were colossal. The liquidation of the Ruhr pocket meant not only the loss of a huge amount of manpower and equipment for Germany, but also the complete destruction of its industrial potential. Without the coal, steel, and armaments produced in the Ruhr, the Third Reich was doomed. The path into Germany was open, and now the Allies could unhindered advance towards the Elbe to meet Soviet troops. The collapse of Army Group B and the capture of hundreds of thousands of soldiers heralded the swift and final end of the war in Europe. This was not just a military success, it was a moral condemnation of Nazi Germany, proof that its days were numbered. The Allies, having crossed the Rhine and destroyed the last major enemy grouping, now stood at the threshold of complete victory. After the liquidation of the Ruhr pocket, when hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were taken prisoner and the industrial heart of the Third Reich ceased to beat, the situation on the Western Front changed dramatically. The Allies, having crossed the Rhine and destroyed the last major enemy grouping, now stood on the threshold of complete victory. Germany's strategic position was hopeless. The Ruhr region, once its industrial backbone, was lost. Its resources, so vital for the continuation of the war, were now either destroyed or in Allied hands. This meant that the production of tanks, artillery, and ammunition had practically ceased, dooming the Wehrmacht to agony. The Allied armies, emboldened by success, rapidly advanced deep into Germany. Before them lay an almost defenseless territory. The roads, though damaged by bombing, were open. German troops, who could have offered some resistance, were either destroyed in the pocket or retreated in complete disarray, lacking fuel, ammunition, and organized command. This was not an offensive. It was a victory march, a race to the Elbe. The American 1st, 9th, and 3rd Armies, as well as the British 2nd Army, moved eastward with incredible speed. Their main goal was to reach the Elbe River as quickly as possible, where they were expected to meet the Soviet troops advancing from the east. Every day, the Allies covered tens of kilometers, liberating cities and villages that offered almost no resistance. The local population, tired of the war and the Nazi regime, often greeted them as liberators. The speed of the advance was so staggering that Allied logistics services barely kept up with the advancing units. Fuel, food, and ammunition had to be delivered by air or by hastily restored rail and road routes. This was a complex but solvable task, given the complete Allied air superiority and their colossal resources. At this time, significant changes occurred in the plans of the Allied command. Initially, the main goal of the Western Allies was to encircle and destroy German troops on the Rhine, and then advance to the Elbe. However, as events unfolded, a new, more ambitious strategic goal emerged: the race for Berlin. The question of who would be the first to capture the capital of the Third Reich became not only a military, but also a political one. British Field Marshal Montgomery, as well as some American generals, insisted that the Western Allies should strive for Berlin. They believed that the capture of the Nazi German capital would have enormous symbolic and political significance, strengthening the positions of the Western powers in the post-war world. However, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, Dwight D. Eisenhower, held a different view. He proceeded from purely military considerations, believing that an assault on Berlin would incur huge losses, as the city would be defended to the last. Furthermore, he understood that Berlin, according to previously reached agreements between the Allies, was to be in the Soviet zone of occupation. Eisenhower did not want to risk the lives of his soldiers for a political goal that was not directly related to ending the war. He believed that focusing efforts on destroying the remaining German troops and meeting with Soviet units on the Elbe was a more sensible strategy. Ultimately, the decision was made in favor of Eisenhower. The main forces of the Western Allies were directed to the Elbe, not to Berlin. This did not mean that they stopped their offensive. On the contrary, their advance was swift and unstoppable. American troops, having reached the Elbe, stopped, awaiting the approach of the Red Army. This was a strategic decision that influenced the post-war arrangement of Europe. The race to the Elbe was not just a military maneuver. It was a symbol of the end of the war on the Western Front. It showed the complete collapse of German resistance and the inevitable end of Nazi Germany. The Allied armies, having crossed the Rhine, now stood in the heart of Germany, awaiting a meeting that would mark the end of the most terrible conflict in human history. The Rhine operation, like any large-scale military campaign, was not the result of a single brilliant decision or a single heroic act. Its success was a complex amalgam of many factors, each of which played its role in the final defeat of Nazi Germany on the Western Front. It was a triumph of military art, technological superiority, unprecedented logistics, and, of course, the courage of millions of soldiers. Let us analyze in detail what ensured this decisive success. The main and perhaps most obvious factor was the overwhelming material and technical superiority of the Allies. By March 1945, the Allied armies possessed practically inexhaustible supplies of weapons, ammunition, fuel, and provisions. American and British factories worked in 3 shifts, producing tanks, airplanes, and artillery in quantities that Germany could only dream of. While German troops suffered from a chronic shortage of everything, the Allies could afford the massive use of equipment and resources. This was evident in everything, from the number of trucks providing supplies to the number of tanks thrown into battle. This material superiority was not merely quantitative, it was qualitative. The Allies had modern equipment that surpassed German counterparts in many respects. Furthermore, and this is perhaps a key point, was complete air superiority. The Luftwaffe, once a formidable force, had practically ceased to exist by 1945. Allied air power, thousands of bombers and fighter bombers, reigned supreme in the skies over all of Western Europe. This allowed not only for massive strikes against German fortifications, transport hubs, and troop concentrations, but also ensured the unhindered advance of ground forces. Any attempt by the Germans to concentrate troops or transfer reserves was immediately suppressed from the air. Constant bombing paralyzed German logistics, destroying railways, bridges, and warehouses. German soldiers were forced to move only under the cover of night, which significantly slowed their reactions and maneuverability. The effectiveness of intelligence also played a huge role. The Allies possessed a developed system of agent, aerial, and electronic intelligence. They knew about the location of German units, their numbers, condition, and movements. The deciphering of German codes, thanks to the work of British cryptographers at Bletchley Park, gave the Allies invaluable information about the enemy's plans. This allowed operations to be planned taking into account the weaknesses of the German defense and to strike at the most vulnerable points. For example, precise knowledge of the condition of German bridges across the Rhine, although it did not directly lead to the capture of the Remagen bridge, gave a general idea of the extent of their readiness for demolition. Logistics, often underestimated, became one of the pillars of the Rhine operation's success. The transfer of millions of soldiers, thousands of units of equipment, and millions of tons of cargo across the Atlantic, and then across all of France and Belgium to the Rhine. This was an unprecedented logistical challenge. The Allies created a complex but extremely effective supply system, including sea, rail, road, and even air transport. Engineering troops, as we have already said, did a colossal job of building bridges and ensuring uninterrupted movement. This allowed for maintaining a high tempo of attack and not giving the Germans a breather. Speaking of the military art of command, one cannot fail to mention Dwight Eisenhower. His strategic vision, his ability to coordinate the actions of huge armies from different countries, his ability to find compromises between ambitious generals, all of this was decisive. Despite disagreements with Montgomery, Eisenhower was able to ensure a common strategic line that led to success. Montgomery, with his narrow front and massive strike, also demonstrated mastery. His plunder operation was a model of military planning and execution. On the other hand, the courage and selflessness of ordinary soldiers, from infantrymen storming trenches to sappers building bridges under fire, were the foundation upon which this victory was built. They fought in the toughest conditions, overcoming fear and fatigue, performing their assigned tasks. Their morale, reinforced by confidence in victory and good supplies, was not broken, unlike that of the German troops. And, of course, one cannot fail to mention the mistakes of the German command. The main one was the inability to adequately assess the situation and make realistic decisions. Hitler, in his blind fanaticism, demanded to fight to the last, forbidding any retreat and surrender. He underestimated the strength of the Allies and overestimated the capabilities of his own exhausted troops. This led to senseless losses and the final collapse of the defense. Field Marshal Model, although a talented military leader, found himself in a hopeless situation, tied hand and foot by the Führer's orders. His attempts to organize an effective defense were doomed to failure in the face of the enemy's total superiority. The capture of the Remagen bridge, although it was the result of chance, became a vivid example of the inefficiency of the German defense and the lack of coordination. Thus, the success of the Rhine operation is the result of a comprehensive approach, where every element, from strategic planning to the courage of every soldier, from technological superiority to the enemy's mistakes, came together in a single picture that hastened the end of the war. This was one of the last major operations of World War II, which forever entered history as an example of brilliant military art and overwhelming superiority. And its consequences were colossal, determining not only the course of the war, but also the post-war order of Europe. The Rhineland operation, as the final chord of World War II in the European theater, was not merely another Allied victory. It turned the tide of events, accelerated the collapse of Nazi Germany, and left a profound mark on history. Its significance cannot be overstated, for it was precisely this operation that became the catalyst for a whole series of strategic and political changes that determined the post-war fate of Europe.